The most bizarre war in history, whiskey versus aquavit. Do you think wars are fought only with tanks and missiles, that territorial disputes always end in bloodshed and treaties written in incomprehensible language? Well, the story I'm about to tell you will completely change your perception of conflict. And no, we're not talking about a pillow fight. Today we'll take a journey into the frigid and it turns out surprisingly witty Arctic vodka to discover a conflict that redefined the concept of war. It's a story about two usually friendly nations, a tiny desolate island, and an arsenal of bottles of alcohol. We're about to delve into the legendary Whiskey War, a dispute between Canada and Denmark over Hans Island, which will leave you wondering, did it really happen? Get ready, because sometimes reality far surpasses fantasy, especially when a good glass of wine is involved. Imagine a battlefield. We usually think of desolate expanses, craters, rubble. But now, transport yourself to a place where the landscape is dominated by ice, snow, and an almost surreal silence. We are in the Nares Strait, a stretch of sea between Ellesmere Island, Canada, and Greenland, an autonomous Danish territory. And right here, in the center of this desolate masterpiece of nature, lies our casus belli, Hans Island, a handkerchief of rock just 1.3 square kilometers long, uninhabited, inhospitable, devoid of significant natural resources. In other words, an insignificant dot on the Arctic map, a block of ice that, let's face it, no one in their right mind would ever want. And yet, for decades, it became the center of an international dispute that, while never degenerating into a full blown armed conflict, was nothing short of hilarious. The contenders? On one side, Canada, that vast peaceful nation famous for its forests, ice hockey, and the proverbial kindness of its people. On the other, Denmark, home of the Vikings, Andersen's fairy tales, and another spirit that we will soon see coming into play. Two nations that, so to speak, are usually great friends, NATO members, trading partners, and with a sense of humor that it seems extends to border issues as well. They both shared a passion, a good glass of wine, and a healthy idiosyncrasy for unclear boundaries. The story of this war begins in a rather banal way. In 1973, Canada and Denmark signed a treaty to delimit their maritime borders in the Nares Strait. But there was a problem. They couldn't agree on who owned Hans Island. It was a real channel point in the ocean that had not been explicitly mentioned in any previous agreement. For the Canadians, it was clearly on their side of the line. For the Danes, just as clearly on theirs. And so, instead of fighting each other, they began a confrontation that to call unique is an understatement. No one really wanted the island for its riches. What kind? Ice? Hungry polar bears? But no one wanted to give up the principle of sovereignty either. National honor, as we know, is a serious thing even when a frozen stone is at stake. And here the story takes a decidedly surreal turn. Instead of sending warships and soldiers with guns drawn, the two nations decided to resolve the matter with a decidedly more civilized method, or if you prefer, more alcoholic. In 1984, the Danish Minister of Greenlandic Affairs, Tom Hoyam, landed on Hans Island. Instead of planting a flag and declaring victory with high sounding speeches, he did something much more practical. He left a bottle of aquavit, the famous Scandinavian spirit, and a sign that read, in impeccable English, "Welcome to the Danish island." An unusual welcoming gesture, but one which started a ritual that lasted almost 40 years. Shortly after, a Canadian patrol, obviously annoyed by this alcoholic invasion, responded in kind. They landed on the island, removed the Danish flag, planted their own, and, in true Canadian style, did not miss their signature gesture: a bottle of Canadian Club, a renowned whiskey, with a sign that read, "Welcome to Canada." And so the cycle had begun. From then on, Hans Island became a kind of alcoholic post office box, the scene of a decidedly unconventional exchange of courtesies. Whenever a military patrol from either nation approached the island, the ritual was clear. The Canadians would arrive, proudly raise their maple leaf flag, leave a bottle of good Canadian whiskey, sometimes accompanied by a friendly note or token of their passage, and then depart. A few days or weeks later, the Danes arrived. They landed, lowered the Canadian flag, replaced it with their own Dannebrog, collected the precious Canadian booty, and in turn left their offering, a bottle of aquavit, along with a message reaffirming, with an implicit smile, Danish sovereignty, sometimes even a packet of Danish biscuits. It was, in effect, an alcohol trade disguised as a territorial dispute, an Arctic black market where the currency was spirits and the pledge was a tiny plot of land. Picture the scene: soldiers in heavy parkas and balaclavas, their breath condensing in the freezing air. They don't carry weapons, but they carry crates. Their cheeks red from the cold are probably also a little red from the spirit of this bizarre contest. Instead of threatening each other, they exchanged imaginary smiles and toasts, knowing that the other enemy would appreciate the gesture. Flags fluttered in the gusting wind, alternating like a macabre diplomatic ballet. It became known as the world's friendliest war, a model of how nations can quarrel without resorting to violence. This wasn't a war fought, but a war drunk. And if you look closely, a war where everyone won because at least they had a good excuse to stock up on superior alcohol. For years, decades, this charade continued. The Whiskey War became a legend, an international joke that demonstrated how, at times, humor and a lighthearted approach can diffuse tensions that, in other contexts, might have escalated. It even created an unusual spirit of camaraderie between the military personnel of the two nations who, although they never met in person on the island, exchanged messages and gifts that strengthened their bond. The world watched with a mixture of amazement and amusement, calling this dispute a unique example of alcoholic diplomacy. But even the funniest wars must eventually end. After nearly 50 years of drinking and flag lowering, the two nations decided it was time to put an end to this bizarre dispute. In 2022, a historic agreement was reached. Canada and Denmark agreed to divide Hans Island almost exactly in half, drawing a border that bisected it. It is the first time that two European and North American countries have established a land border, a historic fact in itself, and an epilogue decidedly less dramatic than the word war might suggest. The resolution came with a handshake, and it is not difficult to imagine, probably a toast. So, what can we learn from this incredible story? Perhaps sometimes a good sense of humor, a little creativity, and the willingness not to take everything too seriously can lead to much more effective and peaceful solutions than any armed conflict. And most importantly, it teaches us a fundamental lesson for any argument: never show up to a confrontation without a good bottle of alcohol. If this story made you smile and think, then don't miss the next video that pops up on your screen.